The howling wind carried the first drops of rain as Abigail Graves clutched her 3-month-old daughter tighter against her chest, desperately pounding on the weathered door of the lone cabin. For 2 days she had traveled across the unforgiving Wyoming Territory, fleeing memories as bitter as the approaching storm. "Please," she called out, her voice nearly lost in the rising gale. "Is anyone there?" Behind the door, Mason Vance set down his coffee cup, the unexpected knocking pulling him from thoughts of tomorrow's cattle drive. Few visitors came to his remote homestead 15 miles outside of Sweetwater Springs, especially with a storm brewing. Retrieving his revolver from the table, caution being second nature in the frontier of 1876, he approached the door. "Who's there?" he called out gruffly, one hand on his weapon. "A traveler," came a woman's voice, trembling with cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "Please, I have a baby." Mason slid back the bolt and opened the door. The sight before him stole the words from his mouth. A young woman stood shivering in the growing darkness, her bonnet soaked through, clutching a small bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. Her eyes, the color of summer sage, were rimmed with exhaustion. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir," she said, trying to keep dignity in her voice despite her desperate state. "Our wagon broke down a mile back. I saw your chimney smoke." Thunder cracked overhead as the baby began to whimper. Without another thought, Mason stepped aside. "Come inside, both of you," he said, his voice gentler now. "You'll catch your death out there." Abigail hesitated only a moment before stepping across the threshold, the warmth of the cabin embracing her like an answered prayer. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun. His brown hair was tousled, and his eyes, a warm amber, held a kindness that made her chest tighten with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her legs nearly giving way beneath her. Mason quickly closed the door against the worsening storm and guided her to a chair by the fire. "Sit. Warm yourself." As she settled into the chair, the baby's cries grew stronger. Abigail tried to soothe her, but her own hands were shaking too badly. "How long have you been out there?" Mason asked, stoking the fire to bring up more heat. "We've been traveling since dawn," she answered, gently rocking her daughter. "The wheel axle broke just as the storm was coming in." She looked up at him, vulnerability clear in her face. "I didn't know what else to do." Mason nodded, studying her more carefully now. Her clothes, though damp and travel-worn, were of good quality. A thin gold band gleamed on her left hand. "You're a long way from anywhere, madam." "Abigail," she offered. "Abigail Graves, and this is Emma." She pulled back the blanket slightly to reveal a red-faced infant with wisps of dark hair. "Mason Vance," he replied, his eyes lingering on the baby. "You hungry? I've got stew on the stove." "That would be wonderful, Mr. Vance." "Mason," he corrected, moving to the small kitchen area. As he ladled the stew into a bowl, he glanced back at her. "Where's your husband, Mrs. Graves?" Abigail's expression tightened, her gaze dropping to the gold band on her finger. "Dead," she said quietly. "Typhoid took him 3 months ago, just after Emma was born." Mason set the bowl in front of her, along with a chunk of cornbread. "I'm sorry to hear that." She adjusted the baby in one arm and reached for the spoon with her free hand. "We were headed for my cousin's place in Oregon. She wrote that I could stay with her family." Abigail took a bite of the stew, surprising herself with how ravenous she felt. "This is delicious." "Nothing special," Mason shrugged, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Just know how to keep myself from starving." As Abigail ate, Emma began to fuss again. With practiced movements, Abigail shifted her position to feed the baby discreetly. Mason respectfully turned his attention to stoking the fire, giving her privacy. "You've got cattle?" she asked, noticing the ranching equipment around the cabin. Mason nodded. "About 100 head. Not much compared to some spreads, but it's mine. Been building it for 5 years now. All alone. Just me and a hand I hire during calving season. Name's Hector." He settled into the chair across from her. "He's in town for supplies, should be back tomorrow, weather permitting." The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the cabin, followed by a tremendous crack of thunder that made Abigail jump. Emma wailed in protest. "It's all right, little one," Abigail murmured, stroking her daughter's cheek. To Mason, she said, "I hope I'm not imposing. Once the storm passes, you'll stay the night," Mason said firmly. "No sense in heading out in this. Tomorrow we can see about your wagon." Relief washed over Abigail's face. "Thank you, truly." As the night deepened, Mason prepared a place for Abigail and Emma to sleep in his small bedroom, insisting he would take the chair by the fire. Abigail was too exhausted to argue. Within minutes of laying her head down, with Emma nestled safely beside her, she fell into the deepest sleep she'd had in months. Mason sat by the fire, listening to the storm and thinking about the strange turn his solitary life had taken in a single evening. There was something about Abigail Graves that stirred protective instincts he thought long dormant. Perhaps it was the child or the grief she carried so bravely. Whatever it was, he knew he would help her as long as she needed. Morning broke with startling clarity, the storm having washed the world clean. Mason had already been up for hours, tending to his morning chores. When Abigail emerged from the bedroom with Emma in her arms, he was frying bacon and eggs over the stove. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Her hair, freed from its pins, cascaded down her back in auburn waves. Mason turned, momentarily struck by the sight of her in the morning light. "Morning, sleep well, better than I have in months," she admitted. "Emma too." "She usually wakes several times in the night." He nodded toward the coffee pot. "Help yourself. Breakfast is almost ready." They ate in comfortable silence, the events of the previous night having created an unexpected bond between them. After breakfast, Mason suggested they ride out to examine her wagon. "Emma can stay here," Abigail said, glancing at her daughter who had fallen asleep again. Mason shook his head. "We'll take her with us. Not safe to leave a baby alone, even for a short while." They fashioned a sling from one of Mason's clean shirts, securing Emma to Abigail's chest. Then, with Mason leading the way on his sturdy bay gelding, Abigail riding a gentle mare from his small stable, they set out toward the broken-down wagon. The damage was worse than Abigail had described. Not only was the axle broken, but one of the wheels had split beyond repair. Her horse, an elderly mare, was grazing nearby, seemingly no worse for the adventure. "I can fix the axle," Mason said, examining the damage, "but that wheel needs replacing." "I've got an old one that might work back at the ranch." Abigail nodded, surveying the wagon that contained everything she owned in the world. "I can pay you for your trouble, Mr. Vance." "Mason," he reminded her gently, "and there's no need for payment. Neighbors help neighbors out here." "We're hardly neighbors," she said with a small smile. He looked at her thoughtfully. "Everyone's a neighbor in this territory, Mrs. Graves, too few of us not to be." They salvaged what they could from the wagon, Abigail's clothes, some household items, and a small wooden box she clutched tightly before stowing in her saddlebag. Mason hitched her horse to follow them, and they made their way back to his cabin. Over the next few days, Mason worked on repairing the wagon while Abigail kept house, cooking meals and tending to Emma. Hector returned from town, eyebrows raised at finding a woman and baby in residence, but he said nothing beyond a polite greeting. On the evening of the third day, as they sat on Mason's small porch watching the sunset, Abigail broke their comfortable silence. "I should be moving on soon," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "I've imposed on your kindness long enough." Mason looked at her, noticing how the setting sun caught the copper highlights in her hair. "You're no imposition, Abigail." The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Still, I have a long journey ahead." Mason was quiet for a moment, then said, "Winter's coming fast. Another month and the mountain passes to Oregon will be snowed in. What are you suggesting? That maybe you ought to consider wintering here in Sweetwater Springs. Come spring, the journey would be safer for both you and Emma." The suggestion took root in Abigail's mind, blooming with possibilities. I wouldn't know where to stay. Town's got a boarding house, Mason offered. Or you could stay here. The words tumbled out before he could reconsider them. I've got the space and it would save you money. You could help around the ranch. Abigail studied him, this man who had shown her nothing but kindness since the moment she knocked on his door. People would talk. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. People always talk, question is whether we care. The next morning, they rode into Sweetwater Springs. The small frontier town consisted of one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a small church at the far end. Curious eyes followed them as Mason helped Abigail down from her horse, Emma secured in the sling against her chest. Mrs. Caldwell runs the general store, Mason explained as they tied their horses to the hitching post. She knows everyone and everything in this town. Inside the store, a plump woman with gray streaked hair looked up from her ledger, her face brightening at the sight of Mason. Mason Vance, twice in 1 month. The world must be ending. Hello, Mrs. Caldwell, he said with a warm smile. I'd like you to meet Abigail Graves and her daughter, Emma. Mrs. Caldwell's shrewd eyes took in Abigail's travel-worn appearance and the baby. Welcome to Sweetwater Springs, dear. What brings you to our little corner of nowhere? Before Abigail could answer, the door opened again and a tall man in a black suit entered. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Mason. Vance, he said coldly. Rutherford, Mason replied, equally frigid. Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat. Judge Rutherford, have you met Mrs. Graves? She's new to town. The judge gave Abigail a cursory nod before returning his attention to Mason. Still squatting on that land, Vance. You know that property should have been part of my holdings. I have the deed, Rutherford, fair and square. The tension in the room thickened. Abigail instinctively stepped closer to Mason, her hand protectively covering Emma's head. We'll see about that, Rutherford said, before turning on his heel and leaving. Don't mind him, Mrs. Caldwell said once the door closed. He's still sore that Mason outbid him on that parcel of land 5 years ago, best water access for miles. Mason's jaw was tight. He's been trying to run me off ever since. Abigail looked at him with new understanding. This kind man had battles of his own. They purchased supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, and fabric for Abigail to make new clothes for herself and Emma. As they loaded their purchases onto the horses, Mason noticed Abigail watching a young couple with their children across the street. Do you miss it? He asked quietly. Town life. Abigail shook her head. Not town life, just belonging somewhere. She adjusted Emma in her arms, having someone to share the load. Their eyes met, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. Back at the ranch, days fell into a comfortable routine. Abigail took over the household duties, cooking and cleaning with a competence that impressed Mason. He, in turn, showed her the workings of the ranch, teaching her to milk the cow and tend the small vegetable garden that had been sorely neglected. Emma thrived under the joint care, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. She had taken to Mason, her tiny face lighting up whenever he entered the room. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would hold her while Abigail prepared dinner, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the infant. One evening, as autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Abigail found Mason on the porch, staring thoughtfully at the horizon. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, joining him. He glanced at her, a soft smile forming. "Just thinking about how different things are now." "Different good or different bad? Different good," he assured her. "Very good." Their shoulders were nearly touching as they sat side by side. Abigail was acutely aware of his presence, the solid warmth of him. Over the weeks, something had shifted between them, a slow, steady current drawing them closer. "Mason," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking about what happens when spring comes." His expression sobered. "And I'm not sure Oregon is where I belong anymore." She looked down at her hands, still bearing the gold band of her marriage. "Thomas and I had a good life, but it wasn't always easy. He had dreams bigger than his means." Mason listened silently, giving her the space to continue. He was a good man, but he left us with nothing but debts and memories. She twisted the ring on her finger. My cousin offered shelter out of duty, not desire. I'd be a burden to her family. You could never be a burden, Abigail, Mason said quietly. Her eyes met his, vulnerability and hope mingling in their depths. I've come to care for this place, for the life here. She took a deep breath. For you, Mason's hand found hers, warm and calloused. I care for you too, both of you. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Slowly, Mason leaned forward, his free hand gently cupping her cheek. Their lips met in a tender kiss, brief but filled with promise. When they parted, Abigail's eyes were shining with unshed tears. I never expected to find this again. Neither did I, Mason admitted. Never thought I'd want to. As winter settled over the territory, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse, life inside the cabin grew warmer. Mason had begun courting Abigail properly, with Mrs. Caldwell's enthusiastic approval serving as the town's blessing. They rode into Sweetwater Springs every Sunday for church services, Abigail proudly carrying Emma, who had become the darling of the congregation. Not everyone approved of their arrangement. Judge Rutherford, in particular, made his disapproval known, muttering about impropriety and loose morals. But the majority of the townsfolk, hardened by frontier life and appreciative of genuine affection, welcomed Abigail into their community. December brought the harshest weather, with blizzards that kept them confined to the cabin for days at a time. During one such storm, as they sat before the fire with Emma sleeping peacefully in a cradle Mason had crafted, Abigail broached a subject that had been on her mind. I should find my own place in town, she said softly, if we're to do this properly. Mason looked up from the bridle he was mending. Is that what you want? It's what's proper, she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. Setting aside his work, Mason moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. Abigail, I've never been one for propriety over sense. You and Emma are safe here. I'm not asking you to leave. But if we're to court, I'm not courting you, he interrupted, taking her hand. At least, not in the way you think. Confusion and hurt flashed across her face. I don't understand. Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. I'm asking you to marry me. He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold band. It was my mother's. Abigail's breath caught. Mason. I love you, Abigail. You and Emma have brought life back to this place and to me. His eyes, earnest and unwavering, held hers. I want to be a husband to you and a father to Emma, if you'll have me. Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks as she nodded, words momentarily beyond her. She slipped the ring onto her finger, next to the band from Thomas that she still wore. Understanding her hesitation, Mason gently removed the first ring, placing it in her palm and closing her fingers around it. He'll always be Emma's father. I would never try to replace him in her memory. Abigail looked at the ring in her hand, then carefully placed it in the pocket of her dress. Thank you, she whispered, before leaning forward to seal their engagement with a kiss. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church, decorated with pine boughs and candles. The entire town turned out for the occasion, with Mrs. Caldwell acting as surrogate mother to the bride. Emma, now 7 months old and beginning to sit up on her own, wore a dress Abigail had sewn from the same fabric as her simple wedding gown. As they exchanged vows, snow began to fall outside, blanketing the world in hushed beauty. Mason's voice was steady as he promised to love and protect both Abigail and Emma for all his days. Abigail's vows, though spoken through tears of joy, were equally firm. The celebration afterward was held at the saloon, cleared of its usual activities for the occasion. There was music from a fiddle player, food contributed by every family in town, and dancing that lasted well into the night. Emma was passed from arm to arm, showered with affection from her new extended family. As midnight approached, Mason found Abigail watching the dancers, her eyes bright with happiness. Mrs. Vance, he said, offering his hand, may I have this dance? She placed her hand in his, the gold band catching the light. "You may, Mr. Vance." They moved together in perfect harmony, the struggles and sorrows that had brought them to this moment fading into the background. For now, there was only the music, the warmth of the community surrounding them, and the promise of a future together. Spring arrived with a gentle persistence, melting the snow and coaxing new life from the earth. The ranch flourished under their joint care, with Abigail proving herself as capable in ranching matters as she was in household ones. Emma, now crawling and babbling, had Mason wrapped around her tiny finger. One warm afternoon, as they picnicked by the creek that ran through their property, Mason brought up the future. "I've been thinking about expanding the herd," he said, watching Emma chase a butterfly through the grass. "Maybe build a bigger house too." Abigail leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "That sounds wonderful." "There's something else," he said, a note of hesitation in his voice. "Judge Rutherford's been making noise again about my claim to this land." Abigail straightened, concern crossing her features. "What kind of noise?" "Says he's found some technicality in the original sale, that it should have been included in his father's land grant." Mason sighed. "He's taking it to the territorial court next month. Can he do that, after 5 years? He's a judge with connections in Cheyenne. He can try." Mason squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry. I've got the deed and it's solid. We're not going anywhere." Despite his confidence, worry gnawed at Abigail in the following weeks. The ranch had become home in a way no place had been since her childhood. The thought of losing it, especially to someone like Rutherford, was unbearable. The day before they were to travel to Cheyenne for the hearing, Abigail was sorting through her sewing basket when her fingers brushed against something hard. Pulling it out, she found the wooden box she had salvaged from the wagon months ago. Inside were the few mementos she had of Thomas' letters, a pocket watch that no longer worked, and a stack of legal papers. As she rifled through them, a name caught her eye: Rutherford. Heart-pounding, she read the document carefully, then read it again. By the time Mason returned from checking the herd, she was waiting for him on the porch, the paper clutched in her hand. "I think I found something," she said without preamble. Mason listened intently as she explained. Thomas had been a clerk for a law firm in Denver before they married. One of the cases he had worked on involved land grants in the Wyoming Territory, specifically the verification of boundaries for the original Rutherford claim. "According to this," Abigail said, pointing to a notation in Thomas's handwriting, "the original survey was flawed. The Rutherford claim never extended to include this parcel. It was public land, available for legitimate purchase exactly as you bought it." Mason studied the document, hope kindling in his eyes. This could be the evidence we need. The next day, they left Emma in Mrs. Caldwell's capable hands and made the journey to Cheyenne. The territorial courthouse was imposing, designed to remind citizens of the weight and authority of the law. Judge Rutherford was already there, looking smug as he conferred with his lawyer. When their case was called, Rutherford presented his argument first, spinning a tale of administrative errors and rightful ownership. His lawyer produced maps and documents, all carefully selected to support their claim. Then it was Mason's turn. He spoke simply and honestly about his purchase of the land, his development of the property, and his intention to pass it down to future generations. When he introduced Abigail's document, Rutherford's face turned an alarming shade of red. The territorial judge examined the papers carefully, asking pointed questions about their provenance. Abigail explained her late husband's role in the original survey verification, her voice steady despite Rutherford's glaring. After both sides had presented their cases, the judge called a brief recess to consider his ruling. Mason and Abigail waited in tense silence, hands clasped tightly together. When the court reconvened, the judge's decision was unequivocal. Mason's claim to the land was valid and legally binding. Rutherford's case was dismissed, with a stern warning about wasting the court's time with frivolous claims. As they left the courthouse, Rutherford brushed past them, his face twisted with anger. "This isn't over, Vance," he hissed. Mason's arm tightened around Abigail's waist. "Yes, it is, Rutherford. Let it go." The journey home was filled with relieved laughter and plans for the future. They collected Emma from Mrs. Caldwell, who insisted on hearing every detail of their triumph. That night, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge, Emma sleeping peacefully inside, Mason pulled Abigail close. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For knocking on my door that stormy night, for bringing Emma into my life." He kissed her softly. "For saving our home." Abigail smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Our home," she repeated, savoring the words. A year later, on Emma's second birthday, Abigail presented Mason with news of their expanding family. His joy was boundless as he swung her around the kitchen, Emma clapping her hands and demanding to be included in the celebration. The new house was completed just in time for the birth of their son, Matthew Thomas Vance, a sturdy boy with his father's amber eyes and his mother's determination. Emma took to her role as big sister with earnest responsibility, solemnly explaining the workings of the ranch to her baby brother as if he could understand every word. As the years passed, the Vance ranch prospered. They added to their cattle herd, planted orchards, and built a reputation for fair dealings and quality stock. 2 more children joined their family, Sarah in 1879 and James in 1881, filling the house with laughter and occasional chaos. Judge Rutherford eventually left Sweetwater Springs for a position in Denver, his defeat at the hands of the Vances never quite forgotten. The town grew slowly but steadily, with a school established in 1880 where Emma proudly attended as one of the first students. On the 10th anniversary of the night Abigail had knocked on Mason's door, they hosted a gathering for the entire community. The ranch, now one of the most successful in the territory, was decorated with lanterns and bunting. Tables groaned under the weight of food, and a band played as neighbors danced under the stars. As the celebration wound down, Mason found Abigail standing in the same spot where she had once appeared like an apparition in a storm, a desperate widow with a baby in her arms. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Vance," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. She leaned into his embrace, watching their 4 children playing with the other town children. 10 years, she marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. "Best decision I ever made, inviting you in that night." Abigail turned in his arms, her face softened by the years but still as beautiful to him as the day they met. "I was so afraid," she admitted, "afraid of being alone, afraid of failing Emma. And now—" She smiled, the full, radiant smile that still took his breath away. "Now I know that the greatest courage is opening your heart again after loss, and the greatest blessing is finding someone willing to open theirs in return." Mason kissed her then, a decade of love and partnership in the gentle press of his lips against hers. Around them, their home and family stood as testament to what could grow from the simplest act of kindness. A door opened on a stormy night, and a voice saying, "Come inside, both of you."